Okay, I'll ask Professor Legales to moderate the Q&A answer. Please show us your hands. We'll take a few answers and give back the floor to Eugene. But before that, maybe you want to answer, Patrick or not?
Yes, no, I would, please, yeah. It's, answering is the least I can do, given that excellent, really close reading. It's not often that we get someone, anyone, but especially someone who is so well renowned as Patrick in the disciplines that we work in, to focus and pay attention to your work in as much detail as he clearly did. So it's the least I can do in that sense. And also, I think it's really important and really gratifying to have a situation where somebody tells you in no uncertain terms that they're not necessarily buying it, or not necessarily buying any of it, and especially and I do appreciate I was going to come to that in a second, but I think especially in a context of a conference called City Debates, as he said at the beginning of his comments, it's good to debate, and the ideas hopefully get better as a result of that. I appreciate it. I'm thankful for Patrick's supportive words around many of these issues. It's good to feel as if some of the stuff you're doing is useful and useful to others. I will fully commit though to as perhaps a mea culpa that the relationality thing was a joint paper with me and Kevin, so I'm as much to blame for any criticisms in that way as he was. Okay, so I was scribbling desperately as Patrick was talking. I can't do anything but try to go through the points in the same order that he made them. I just don't have time to try and rework them in other ways. So I'll start at the very beginning, as Mary Poppins once said. Urban studies. Yeah, there's an interesting thing here about urban studies being bad at public policy. The periodization that Patrick offered is interesting. There is certainly in urban geography, the period that he identified as a period of waning interest in public policy is a period where I would have to say that I feel a lot of valuable perspectives and ideas emerged, but the language of them often diverged from the language of political science and maybe political sociology as well, and that leads then to his second point, that often our disciplines develop in isolation or become more isolated from each other in not very useful ways. So he cautions us not to reinvent necessarily the work of sociologists and political scientists, and I take the point. I would also say that sometimes the work of some of those people deserves reinvention. And what we tried to do, one of the things that a number of us were trying to figure out when we started thinking about this was, as we increasingly thought about the need to consider the role of cities acting globally. As an aside, the reason I got into this was I had written, as a graduate student, I had written a couple of critiques of the global cities literature, so the literature on global cities as financial centres. And I realised that at some point I was going to have to put my money where my mouth was if I was going to critique that literature in the sort of particular way that it theorises globalness in that very specific context. And for me then, obviously, given my background, my interests, I was interested in thinking, okay, well, how do cities act globally in terms of policy? So then, me and others was casting around for a way to deal with that. And the obvious literature is the political science literature on policy transfer. And that's the literature that we try directly to engage with, and that may have put blinkers on for us, that we could have been looking at other literatures. We tried to critique that literature in some ways, especially its kind of methodological nationalism, which is a point you made a good point about this that I'll come back to. That political science literature has tended to talk about national governments engaging with other national governments, the British government borrowing policies from the, Thatcher's government borrowing policies from Reagan's government and so on. Or in the few cases with someone like Diane Stone, for example, who works in that field, talking about interlocal policy, but doing it in the way you said. Like interlocal policy transfer meant within a given polity, it meant a given nation state, and that was as far as it went. This was at the same time as we had literature stretching back from the early, or stretching back to the early 90s, with people like Eric Swingadow and Bob Jessup and Jamie Peck and others telling us that the state was being hollowed out and that certain responsibilities were going up to the international organisations, other ones were being downloaded. And the idea that cities then, with Harvey's intervention, cities were being forced to become entrepreneurial and to engage almost through, there was a little literature on municipal foreign policy for a while. So we were trying to, in some ways, engage with, not throw out entirely, but try in some ways to reinvent that political science literature. And we tried even to engage in their journals with it a little bit, and we haven't gotten very far in terms of the engagement. But I think there are ways that there might be other avenues that we could travel down to deepen these ideas, so that's a point worth taking. That leads to a point that you didn't make in these terms, but the way I wrote it down was you emphasised that cities are not special. And this gets to, so this is the thing about, like a lot of stuff that we're talking about at the city level has been done by at the national level for a long time. And yes and no, right? And what we're jumping into here is a very muddy, deep pool of sociology and geography talking about the urban question and whether there is an urban question, whether cities are an object of analysis in and of themselves. How important is urbanisation as a process versus other processes that produce particular political economies? For me, I would say that I think that there are aspects of cities that are particularly special in the maybe sort of strict sense of that term. Whereas again, it would be silly and it would be unproductive to turn ourselves inwards as if there is no relationship to the national state. And a point I've tried to make in a few of my papers, but never in a fully laid out way, but really just almost always in a comment in the conclusions of papers, is that we can't forget that a lot of the mobilisation of policies that goes on among cities is actually happening through the facilitation of the national state actors. So there was an example, for example, I did some work a few years ago with colleagues in Dubai, tracing that Vancouver landscape and how it ended up in Dubai. And we ended up, as part of that research, we needed to interview the Canadian ambassador to the United Arab Emirates to get at some of the issues that were going on here, because the national state, the Canadian national state, were interested in facilitating Canadian architecture firms, design firms, builders, developers. They were trying to make connections between their Canadian industry on urban building, city building, and the booming at that time, still booming. It was just before the economic crisis, the still booming Dubai economy. So absolutely, it's important not to lose sight of the national state. The national state hasn't gone anywhere. It may have changed, but it's still crucially important. The next issue, which I thought was really interesting, that Patrick brought up in a couple of ways, is around this question of assemblage on the one hand and hegemony on the other, a more post-structuralist perspective, or at least social constructivist perspective versus a more structuralist perspective. That is I think quite a productive tension in urban studies to work through that. I'm not sure I'm convinced that it's entirely either or, that we need to necessarily only talk about the most fluid Latourian notion of assemblage, where everything is ephemeral and always changing, or we have to it's an epistemological question, or maybe an ontological question in a sense, like, or where we think, on the other hand, that everything works through stabilised and quite unchanging or infrequently changing structures. I think to me what's interesting about the way in which cities are governed is how those two things clash or complement each other, where in some ways you have these kind of gurus, both either inside a state administration or you know, the traveling gurus like Richard Florida and so on, who are kind of like, things are changing and so on, and new ideas are flowing in, and there's this imperative to again be competitive, to be entrepreneurial, to be different, to do something different. That idea that change is good, that it's important always to be showing that you're trying the next thing. And on the other hand, I think, yes, I think that you make a really important point that I think maybe our literature is not doing enough of, is focusing on the fact that there is a great deal of obduracy within the state in some ways, and a lot of stasis, and in many ways that's good. We really wouldn't want our basic social services to be changing every week to some sort of new model. And to me, it's not about either or. It's about both as an empirical focus, it's thinking about how the two work together, but also then as a conceptual approach, thinking about how we can account for the two working together by drawing some ideas from more post-structuralist work versus others. But I think we have to be careful about how we do it. I think we have to be studied in how we do it, and perhaps it's not always the case that we are. Perhaps
it's difficult.
Yeah. Immobility, I think, I tried to touch on this. One of the ways that I'm trying to deal with this is through the idea of policy frontiers and blockage and stopping. But also others in the literature are working on it in the sense of policies that never happen on a global stage. And what it's very hard to study that. This becomes a methodological challenge too. It's quite, in some ways, quite easy to study the ones that get talked up, right? Of course, you want to study them critically. The ones that get left behind or never get a start, that is a challenge that I think still needs to be dealt with. Imitation, I think you're absolutely right. There is a lot of imitation goes on, and the legitimacy aspect of that is true. And I think especially think in the context of emergencies as acute crises, if that's not a redundancy. That in emergencies, imitation, you have to be shown to be moving fast, but fast isn't always necessarily best, even if the language of best practices tends to win out very often. And an interesting point at the end about crisis being often not making many changes or only making changes for the structures that are already in place, I think is very true. I think, as I said earlier, these I didn't mention hegemony, we'll get back to that. The counter-hegemonic processes that I was mentioning, I said that they struggle to get a move on. And they often, it takes outside backing of resources that not many social movements have, that to get them moving. And actually, the harm reduction model that I've talked about here, I didn't get into this in the talk, but the funding for a lot of the momentum for this movement is through the Open Societies Foundation, which is George Soros's way of changing the world. And we can think carefully about the benefits or otherwise of that. I think it's a bit of both probably. Hegemony. I'll end on hegemony. Yeah, I can see what you're saying. Although I always understand hegemony to be to always. It's never complete, right? So it's so hegemony almost by definition, as I understand it, and I'm probably not as well schooled in that literature as you are, but as my understanding would be that the hegemony itself always has opportunities for insurgents of one type or another. I don't know, if you want to respond to that, because I may be...
Well, we'll see. Someone will pick it up.
Okay. So that's a lot in response, but there was a lot there, a lot of really valuable stuff, and I really appreciate Patrick for taking the time.
No, your paper. Questions? maybe you introduce yourself.
Yes,
So.
I am Amir. I'm in the MUD in AUB. When you were talking about policy mobility in crisis, I couldn't but think about the garbage crisis we're having in Lebanon. And then I was thinking, like, I mean, the process is known. Initially, the solution was a direct response for a problem, and it was meant to be a temporary solution, and it went on for years. And now, after this landfill is full, there is a crisis on what to do with the garbage. So I was really thinking, like, is the real problem here is policy and the lack of policy, and if we really need to bring policy or measures from other places of the world, or if the real problem is, you were talking about hegemony, is the hegemony of, let's say, certain, not politics, but a corrupt administration, which is holding some aspects of this policy and hindering certain solutions, which may be exported from other places. So here, I think, is the question really about policy mobility, or if there is really policies to actually help us solve the crisis, or is the question is more of activism or political work to actually enforce policies in places where the actual solution is not, the solution is not a question of whether it's good to bring a policy from somewhere else or whether it's mutated, you change it, if it will work. This is not a question maybe in our context, but it's the question of how can you enforce a certain solution or a certain policy through activism or through political work in a place where the political situation or the political atmosphere is the one that actually hinders the solution for a certain process.
I'll try.
We are both incompetent here, so we're fine.
This is often the problem, right? That in a way you could see the drug policy situation that I described as being similar to this. That you know, until very recently, most places in the world would not have thought for a minute they could change the way in which that population, that problem is addressed. And they would point, for example, to local resistance, to the influence of the US, right up to international conventions that countries have signed. So there's all these reasons why things can't happen. I don't know the details of enough of the details of the garbage crisis here to be able to talk about like what other models might have been proposed or whatever. But often one of the things, and this is one of the things that I struggle with in terms of trying to work through this case of mine, is that one of the problems often is whether or not a particular coalition or coalescence of forces comes together and coalition of actors comes together that is able to be effective by being able to convince people who are in certain positions of power to do things differently. And that then becomes very much a political work, I think. And in the case of the drug policy, it involved a great deal. I mean, I only touched on this. I didn't do credit to all the wonderful actors that have been involved in this and still are. It involved a massive amount of scientific research. It also involved a lot of public changing of public minds in ways that are quite remarkable. How the idea around how people should treat drug users has changed so massively in Vancouver in the last 15 years. So I'm dancing around your question without asking it or answering it. I would say that the question is not always necessarily immediately. Here is a different policy. Look over here in this other part of the world. There's this other model. That can often come later. Often the first point is to decide is to develop some sort of public conversation about who we are and who we want to be, right? And crises can crystallize that sort of conversation. You get people dying all over the place in a 10-block radius of a particular junction in the downtown east side eventually couldn't be hidden anymore. And there was a conversation then about who do we want to be? Is this what we want to be? My sense around here is that if you're in Hanra or if you're in Solidaire, maybe you don't see as much of the garbage crisis. And therefore there maybe is a geographical aspect to a political discussion about connecting people's visions of who we are and where the garbage is.
Can I have a small point on that? Because I just arrived one day before him, so I've just read the newspaper one more day, but I knew nothing. I think he was very smart in his answer. And I make two kind of points. Number one, yes, the garbage crisis is particular to Beirut. On the other hand, that sort of garbage crisis is a classic problem for a number of large cities. And Mexico will have something not so completely different. Dubai doesn't have a crisis yet, but the same problem is looming just next door because it's a complete chaos. And you have a number of places where this question of garbage has some forms of crisis at some point or another. And clearly, and that's one of the points he's making in his paper, we see something about the politics of large metropolis that is quite common in a number of different environments. So number one, it's very central in the policy. Second, yes, you're right, the mode of governance apparently clearly quite structured, and it's quite possible, it seems, to explain the crisis and explain why it is still blocked. On the other hand, maybe one way to move forward would be at some point precisely to use the policy mobility idea and to say, oh, let's build on incinerators, let's use some of these big garbage company, not Lebanese, but outside, from outside, in order to go outside the classic Beirut group. So maybe policy mobility will be one way to move forward and to do with that. So it's a bit early to say maybe policy mobility will play no role. Clearly in the debate, from what I've read, it's already there. And people mention, let's have this solution or this solution. The World Bank will come out with some ideas, let's finance this or this infrastructure. So I think it's a bit early days, but it might be an excellent case to follow Eugene's framework to understand the transformation of the time. Sure.
Sorry to take so long, but actually some of the solutions are there. Like you hear always about these sorting facilities which are not being active because of certain political decisions. You always hear about the central government which is monopolizing the money which is supposed to be the municipalities. So that's, in one way, they are hindering a decentralized solution. So I'm just saying that maybe the policy solutions are there, but the certain political structure is that hinders this solution.
But that's
and this is where
welcome in the world of public policy.
The role of
we know that public policy are often policy solutions are somewhere here, and you need some actors to check them. Okay? You have a cupboard with lots of solutions for everything. And you're right.
I just wanted to just to keep these questions to the end. That I would like to say that.
Could you introduce yourself so that everybody knows?
Yeah, I'm Robertson, but I'm a professor at Harvard and design. I frankly felt extremely marginalized by your intervention as an urban planner and design. I thought that
and
and your intervention actually, what I really felt is that it's too broad and it's over-conceptual. And by too broad, I mean that I was frustrated because when we talk about urban policy, usually urban policy, we feel that urban planning, urban design at the heart of this, are particular instances where policy as such has a direct impact on the city, and therefore it's a central aspect to emphasize, not to broaden the discussion to policy in general. In my opinion, I'm ignorant. I just want to ask you about policy. What makes a policy urban or not urban? This is the first thing that, can we talk about policy as a generic term, or shall we qualify it in such a department from an urban perspective? And second, can we talk about policy as a discursive discussion, or shall we talk about it in terms of an operational strategy, which is because us as urban planners, as opposed to urban geographers, we deal with issues with policy as a dynamic link between the, governance and implementation. So these are the frustrating aspects, and I was also frustrated at the end by one particular aspect by your case study. You gave us the case study about drug use in Vancouver, and you tried to explain to us the concepts of mobility, etc. through this drug use case study. I would have really much more been interested in telling us about the transfer of the Vancouver model to Dubai. And this is really something that we are much more concerned with in this I think, conference than the issue of the drug use in Vancouver. And what's really very interesting is that you did already research, apparently, on this transfer of models, of urban models, actually from a cross-cultural perspective. So, for this reason, I think your introduction was inspirational for me. Okay, it was not only, I did not feel marginalized, but also it gave me some inspiration of what lacking is this conference, actually. Okay. And really what I think is lacking is that, for instance, I get some ideas over here, is that when we are talking about policy and policy mobility, we are at the heart of policy mobility here from a temporal perspective. First, we started having the models of the colonial models that have been imported. Then after that, we had the modernist models that have been imported. Then after that, we had the postmodernist models that have been imported. So there are such policy, substance in relation to this movement of policy models, in relation to urban planning, urban design, within non-Western context, that is a real, very interesting aspect to deal with. Okay. The second aspect that was really inspirational for me is that when you talked about mobility of policy models, in a way they are very much, we can compare them to the mobility of architectural and design models. Okay, and this is something that we need also to table on at this conference, because it's about, this is something that really relates to us, is how these models of especially that both the president and yourself started with these images of global landscapes. Okay, how these global landscapes are being circulated at this particular point, and how they are going through the policy, how policy is in itself a particular vehicle to circulating these particular models. So what I'm starting to think is to do another conference about, okay, a complement to this conference, which really in this case focus on this issue of models. And that is really inspired from what you have said today, but which focuses in this particular case on the urban models themselves, how they are circulated, and also about the architectural models, how they are circulated. This is one.
Okay, thanks. I would begin by, I guess, by saying I would give the conference a chance. I assume that in the next couple of days there will be a lot of examples of that, of these models. I mean, certainly, I was saying to some of the organisers before that I'm actually really quite glad to be talking on the first night. Then I get it done, and then I can sit for the next couple of days and learn a lot from people who are going to be talking. So, Thanks very much for your intervention. There's a lot of critical points in it. Where to begin? Well, I suppose a couple of caveats to begin with. I mean, around some of your concerns. One would be, yeah, I could have talked about the Vancouver to Dubai stuff. However, it was published a number of years ago. The research was done a number of years ago, and my focus my focus across those years, but especially now as I try to wrap up work into something solid. I'm focused on the drug policy. So I feel that it's useful for me to base my comments on the stuff that motivates me most. I'll come back to it in a second though, because I think there is a connection, which because of time and so on, I maybe didn't clarify as much in it, because I myself I've always been interested in an amateur way in architecture and design, and I've done a bit of study in planning, so I'll come back to that in a second. The second point about being conceptual. Well, I hope my reason for going that way, and I wouldn't say that I'm actually particularly conceptual as a scholar. I don't operate it on a big theory kind of level. I work back and forth between sort of medium theory and examples. It's just the way my mind works. But I try to throw out a bunch of concepts that other people might pick up on and develop better than I have. And hopefully, again, the conference in the next 2 days will do that. The drug policy example was interesting, because I was a bit surprised that when you said it first, you felt marginalised by the presentation, although I understood it as you explained. But I see myself as very close to architects and especially urban planning people, urban planners. In fact, I just came from here, from Berlin, from a 3-day or 2-day conference on innovations in spatial planning, where I was talking about these kind of things again, and engaging with planners. One way that you might see a connection is myself and one of my graduate students published a paper end of last year, I guess, on these drug consumption rooms in various places. Now, there's about 90 of these around the world, in about 11 countries and about 60 cities. And to me, one of the things that's important and useful to think about, and partly it's a methodological point, is studying the design and following the thing. So following the design model of these places. So what I showed you in those two pictures was very much the sort of medicalized version of it, which is becoming more and more the standard. Whereas the original versions of these models were very much more, they were produced more in the model of the one in Marseille that I showed, where it's social movement, just finding a space, trying to keep people safe. The places in Amsterdam and in Frankfurt, they operate and look much more that model. They're still much more like drop-in centres that happen to have a place for people to inject in the back. But what you've started to see is a more medicalised and a more professionalised model start to appear and start to be rolled out in other parts of the world. And this is causing a bit of consternation in the harm reduction and drug policy community, as the more traditional European people say this is where the movement is losing control. Drug users themselves are losing control of how they're losing their ability to have a voice in how their medical treatments or interventions are being governed. On the other hand, there's the political expediency of the Sydney and Vancouver model being rolled out in other places. In Ireland, they very specifically talk about Sydney, and they say we are hoping for a medically supervised. That word is intended to clear a lot of political ground. And so I actually think that design is really important in this, in terms of the way they're designed and what it means. And it actually even operates down to the types of equipment that are being used. And for example, I was with the director of the Sydney Centre, who came to Vancouver just a few years ago, much more recently than the original contact, and brought with her certain pieces of equipment that help break up certain pills into injectable form, to show them and to give them to the Vancouver people and say, this works for our clients, this works better than the other ways of doing things. And so I think design is crucial to a lot of this stuff. But I'm interested in design in the way that it provides a lens into power. and into the ways in which governance works.
So just add one little bit. I think your point at the end is important. It's what you said about models. In a way, what is done on policy mobility is to enlarge what has been on transfer model planning. So I think the perspective is quite similar. If you allow me to be non-diplomatic for a second, when you say that it was too broad and over-conceptualized, in a way, I've got this argument all the time with my French colleague in planning. I always tell them that's your problem. You are under-conceptualized and too narrow. So it's a real debate we have on this thing. But you know, I think it's a real point. It's half joking.
Hi, I'm Jata from University. I was very interested by your conceptual framework, especially the 7 themes you presented. However, I was a bit frustrated by the idea that they were not, I didn't find a hierarchy here in these themes. Which one is the most important? I think particularly Galas went through this idea. Which one is the most important? What kind of epistemology, what kind of ontology is behind each of your entries? But what surprised me most, especially when you were talking about hegemony, is in these themes, money doesn't come out. In the 7 themes you talked about, money is absent. While I won't be discovering the wheel when I say that, especially if we're talking in our experience in developing countries and the role of development aid, that policy comes a lot with the money that's behind it. This goes both ways, with international organization bringing policies with money behind it, through grants, and through also what we call counter-hegemonic actors, which are maybe the NGOs, CSOs, etc. Even those actors, they try to adapt to this logic. In a way, they even change their programmatic approaches, they change their interest to develop new expertise to align with possible grants to look into. And so, in this way, I was wondering, where do you put the idea of money that's circulating behind policies?
That's great. Thanks.
You should accelerate where you answer two.
Yeah.
Can I suggest that there are more questions to take them,
Okay.
and then give the floor to Eugene to answer, because I'm very conscious about time.
So one here,
Apologies.
one there.
Yeah.
I'll be quick. It's a comment that comes from the context, from our context actually, and thinking about it. So when you have all these great policies and you have the money behind them, and they're just not coming in. So we get to the point where Région Île-de-France designs the sustainable mobility scheme for the municipality of Beirut, but still it doesn't get implemented. So we get to the point where the World Bank designs the BRT for the Central Planning Authority, but still it doesn't get actually implemented. And so what I loved and was inspired by the talk is also thinking about policy mobility not only through the structures of the macro, but actually how and when do activist groups also try to borrow models from other contexts and bring them to the table, and how that's another way of thinking about policy mobility that may help us think about how to transgress the frontier actually when the analysis of the political economy from the top tells us they're just not interested, there's not money for them, they don't want to do it, the highway lobby is too strong. So I think that there's something very interesting to explore and to analyze in Lebanon about how activist groups over the last decade have been actually using policies from other contexts and trying to implement them from below as a way to change the agenda. And it's something that we've been talking about a lot at the Islam Paris Institute here at AUB, because they're a public policy center and no one wants to listen to their policies. So how do you actually get a policy-making center to become influential? So I think there's interesting things to think about.
Right, you can in school.
Okay, I think part of the...
Can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, well, Mustafa Bayırba also presenting tomorrow.
Oh, we talked on email, yeah?
Yes. Hello, how are you?
Hi.
Okay.
Don't engage in
I
private
don't want to
life.
get too personal here. Okay, I think part of the problem, well, the source of the debate and disagreements come from the fact that the term policy is an overloaded concept. It's an empty signifier almost. But there's a way to solve this problem, I think. And if you just go back to the classical text on public policy is a process. It's not a thing. It consists of stages, right? So which part or which stage of public policy is traveling? If we ask the question, pose those questions this way, then most of the problems will be solved. For example, are we talking about the mobility of a certain institutional or organizational design of decision making? Or are we talking about the imposition of a political arrangement on another context, right? In other words, the power structures that produce those policies. Or are we talking about the problem definitions traveling through epistemic communities? Or are we talking about the implementation structures or implementation programs, right? Which one of them is traveling? So 4 of them could be traveling, being mobile in different ways, right? So if we begin to just bring together the stages approach, basically, the key stages, and just get more nuances out of that discussion, I think we would have more productive debates and some of the answers. And secondly, I have a criticism for Patrick Gagade.
Well, thankfully not for me.
Yes. Because I know him beforehand, so I will help. Okay. So the thing is, well, actually from the Geography Compass, the urban,
Yeah.
there was a recent article came out by Martin Mueller.
Yeah.
So he did an excellent job. I read an article before I came here. So because I knew what was coming. So the interesting thing is he puts the emphasis on not assemblage but agencement. Right, so agencement establishes the connection between hegemony and assemblage. But I don't want to get into detail at this point.
No, that would take time.
For you.
Hello. Thank you very much. My name is Nicolas Kosmatopoulos. In fact, I'm teaching here at the Public Policy Master. I don't know what makes me an expert or not. I very much enjoyed the presentation because it had a little bit of everything, a little bit of assemblage, a little bit of expertise, things that we've been working with. Nevertheless, coming from a point of view of looking at the relationship between policy and politics, and polis, as a Greek anyway, I have the right, I guess, to go back to the terminology. It's a shortcut. And you also said, everything is political, and I guess, nobody will disagree on that. The point is exactly how does it work? How do you explain political? And why I'm asking this, because what we see, for example, is that many times in our generation and before crisis has been used as a post-political tool, just to anger.
Anger.
No discussion. Meaning that while there are political issues, suddenly they've been put out of the public debate, and they say, listen, we have some experts here, they know better. It's not your responsibility to assess your security situation. You have to be assessed through some guys somewhere else.
Yeah.
It's not a public debate anymore. So you take things from the public debate, they are political, and you put them in a post-political framework. It doesn't have to be named like that, but this is actually the process. On the other hand, in fact, the trust crisis shows that crisis can work the other way around. Something that has been out of the public eye through a crisis. And I find the trust crisis very interesting because it's the most democratic crisis you can have, because it affects everybody, rich and poor, and in fact the rich consume more, so they have even more garbage. Unfortunately, they get to dump them probably somewhere else, but it's a very interesting, politicized situation where crisis enters, brings back politics.
Mm-hmm.
So I just want to ask you, how do you differentiate between the two. Is there a way to start talking about crisis as a way to depoliticize the discussion? And this is also something that we have to take into account. And as another example, because I really love the part that you became more specific and empirical, and your example with the drug policy. It reminded me actually the book by Foucault on the Pierre Rivière, where it was a guy who killed his mother, his father, his whole family, and he was brought to justice, and then there was a big fight between the doctor saying, no, he's actually crazy, and the criminologist saying, no, he's a criminal. But nobody was listening to the poor guy. I mean, poor guy, he was not really a poor guy, but he had a voice. And he in fact went against both of the discourses of the experts. He said, I'm neither nor. I'm just a human with my own, understanding of things. I don't want you to interpret my, my action. Speaking about that, why I say that? Because although you presented to us, this policy mobility as a good example, how taking the drug consumption out of the streets into these controlled spaces, we lost the people who do that. I mean, we lost their voices, and it became something medicalized. I understand. It actually became also something very antisocial because I was very much aware of these walls between the two. It became something else. Definitely better because it also, it shows better. The pictures were very telling, but I was, worried. That's the anthropologist coming out of me saying, where are the users? Do they really think clearly? They agree with the policymakers that this is actually the best way forward, although they die less. Okay, the numbers say the truth sometimes, but it's not the only truth that we have to know. Anyway, it's been an ongoing discussion.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I appreciate that. So
I think we both said that we need to.
Okay.
I said nothing.
I actually feel as if all four of those questions and points from the four people, I feel in some ways there may be an overarching answer, and that answer relates to the level at which we enter the problem. And by we, I mean people who are interested in policy mobilities, or people at least who have written on it so far. The entry point for this problem to study it, I think, certainly for me, is the main focus is the how. Right? How is this done? How is this achieved? So on the one side, a how question, and at the same time, a question of like geographical nuance of how one would assume that processes that might be generalized in a certain sense will play out differently in different contexts, in different institutions, in different places. So I think that in a sense that sort of level of entryway means that the question of the resources and the money it's not unimportant, it's crucially important. It's not something I touched on in the time that I had there, apart from a couple of comments I made about obviously the World Bank and et cetera, are pushing neoliberal policies, and they're not all good policies. On the other hand, you've got the Open Societies Foundation particularly pushing harm reduction and funding people to push it at local levels in various places. But for me, certainly, when policies are moving, there's then an empirical question of where the money is coming from. I would, in other words, pretty much be taking it for granted, although I would always want to investigate, but taking for granted that there's money pushing any policy that's moving. And there's certainly resources, let's back out and say resources of one type or another. Even if those resources sometimes are things like linguistic resources, who's able to go to what conferences? They can be resources around comportment. Who knows how to interact in certain settings where knowledge is generated and transferred. So there's a big question of resources there that I would get to through the how question of how is this stuff happening, where and when it's happening. that then leads to the question, the questions about about Lebanon, for example. How are the activists able to get so far but not any further in a particular context, which deals with the other side of it. The question of I get a little jumpy about the idea of separating up policy into stages of a cycle, for example. I think that there's a lot of use to that, but I think that the political science, or certain elements of political science, sort of typologizing has its downsides too, because it creates separation among the stages. And I'm not sure it's that simple. And I think in many ways that the interesting thing for me is to complicate the story, as well as acknowledging the complications, which allows me then to tell a more complicated story, which in some ways may leave things a little bit weaker. But to me, I get a little concerned about like separating things up in that particular way. But there's probably more we could talk about in that context. I personally prefer the term the post-democratic to the post-political, in the sense that what often tends to be happening in the post-political, let's say, is a very political move about taking stuff off the table, right? Yeah. But I thought, on the other hand, what you said there was really interesting about how certain crises can be used to take stuff off the table. Look, this is no time for debate. Don't we want to get our garbage off the streets? Well, maybe we don't, I don't know, but depends who the we is, right? I mean, that becomes the politics of constructing a coalition and constructing an alliance, right? But that other side of it then is how certain crises put things back, like let's say again, re-democratize, open up the previously invisible, technicized. My garbage goes out on a Thursday night, it's gone when I walk out in the morning, that's all I care about, right? Or, I flush the toilet. As cities get all over the world get older, those kind of infrastructures are going to be more and more brought to people's minds in ways that the period since the Industrial Revolution, and certainly since the 20th century, have become less in people's minds. So I think that's a really valuable point. In all those cases, I'm interested in how the practices of this stuff, which then hopefully leads me to say something more, maybe more informative, but that's where I'm heading in, and maybe that's why some of the other stuff kind of fades slightly in the background, especially I'm using that classic excuse, 10 minutes at the end of a talk. It's because I didn't have enough time.
Okay, many thanks. Many thanks for this work.